My friends, long time no see. This is gonna be another video where I'm not building models, I know, but we'll be talking about them, especially about taking pictures. So the past year was kind of weird for all of us, and for modelers it meant no modeling shows. In other words, most of us turned to Facebook, Instagram, modeling forums to share our works with other modelers and like-minded people. And I'm sure a lot of people realized how important photos can be, because at the end of the day you can have the best model in the world, but if the photos are bad, the overall perception is just gonna be bad. Before we get started though, let me put this out of the way. I'm not a professional photographer. That's why the video is titled How to Photograph Your Models Like a Professional. Everything I'm gonna show you is how I do it, not how it is supposed to be done. So okay, let's start with the most basic things. An ideal photographic background is a sheet of white paper. Now, this is most ideal if you want to publish in magazines, because that's what the editor appreciates. But, you know, if you're sharing your works online, you can experiment with different colors. Black, for example, is very contrastful. And you also have gradient backgrounds, such as white towards blue and so on. Or you can do something completely different. For example, if you have a nice modeling mat, that could be theoretically used as a, photographic background. Or maybe try taking photos of your models outside, blue sky as a background. Continuing with basics, a simple cheap IKEA lamp is a really good source of light. Now, the problem with lamps is that they're basically spotlights, so the light source is direct, and this means harsh shadows, which we don't want. And a simple ghetto way to fix that is to tape a piece of office paper over the lampshade. This will act as a diffuser. Here you're gonna need some basic LED bulbs, and ideally, and this is really crucial, the temperature should be 5500 Kelvin, which is natural cold daylight. The ideal amount of light sources is 2, or if possible 3. Moving on to something more purpose-built, this is a light cube or a light tent. And this thing folds on itself and it looks something like this. Now, I've been using this bad boy for more than 10 years, and I photographed most of my magazine articles in it using 3 IKEA lamps. And the way it works is basically you put 2 lamps to the sides, 1 on top, and these walls are light diffusers. So everything is gonna be nice and soft and evenly spread out throughout the whole thing. Now, considering how cheap these little things are, I think it's the most value-oriented option for most modelers who want to take, more than average pictures. Now, I'm not using it anymore because I upgraded my setup to studio softboxes, which I'm actually using right now to light up this video, and the thing about them is that they're really big and not very practical, so unless you're a filmmaker or some hardcore photographer, modeler, content creator or whatever, I think they're not very worth it. And again, going back to cameras, you have an option of DSLR or mirrorless. And of course, phone, which are surprisingly capable these days. Personally, I'm kinda, call it old school, because I've had this Canon M50 for almost a year now. I originally bought it for filmmaking, but I kinda never really got around to, taking pictures. The settings kinda didn't work for me. I'm just probably used to my old Nikon D5100, which is a DSLR, and it still works perfectly. And of course, if you decide to take pictures with one of these, you're gonna need a tripod. It's absolutely crucial that your camera must be stabilized. Of course, again, you can go DIY, you can use a stash of books as a tripod, sort of, or frying pans. I know, been there, done that. But, at the end of the day, these are so cheap that, why not, They're flexible, so to say, you can change angles with them, they can be made really tall, so yeah, a really good thing to have. Okay, so the boring part of the video is almost over. I'm just gonna briefly talk about photo editing, because here's the thing. Some people believe editing photos is like cheating or lying to people, because you're photoshopping things which aren't there. At least I think the point of editing is to make the photograph as close to reality as possible, because cameras, sometimes they don't know what they're supposed to do. For example, if you're photographing a green model and you make a close-up, the camera is gonna think, oh my gosh, that's too much green, I need to turn it red. And the white balance is gonna be all over the place. So then you need to fix it in post-production. But we'll get to that. So let's now actually go to my workbench and let's take some pictures. So first we're gonna try snapping a picture or two with the phone. And one thing about phones is that most of them shoot on full auto. I know that some have manual settings, which is awesome, but we'll get to that once we start shooting on the DSLR. This, on one hand, is pretty good because it does most of the heavy lifting for you, but on the other hand, it's a sort of double-edged sword because the camera sometimes, like I said, doesn't know what to do. So, for example, it can mess with the exposure, with white balance, and also, especially my phone has a lot of problems in studio settings. It's just too much light for it, and most of the time when I'm shooting pictures with it, they're sort of really washed out. So there's nothing else to do but just adjust them a little bit in post-production, which is another benefit of phones, because most of them have built-in photo apps with very powerful and simple to use editing tools. So let's now bring out the big guns. So I'm gonna be shooting on my DSLR Nikon D5100 because I'm more familiar with it, and overall I just like it more than the mirrorless Canon M50. And you should always shoot on full manual, because again, it would be the same story like with the phone. The camera would be doing its own thing and it would be just, the photos would be all over the place. So going manual, you are telling it what to actually do. But again, they have their own limits, but we're gonna take care of that with editing. So let's take a look at my settings. Picture quality. Whenever possible, shoot in RAW because it contains all the information we need to successfully edit the photo and make it as real looking as possible. White balance, preset. Now, this is where limitations of some cameras just happen. For example, the Canon M50, there you can set white balance in kelvins. Here we have just some presets and one manual preset, which you sort of balance using one picture where you think the white balance is as accurate as possible. You know, it helps, but again, we'll do the fine work in post-production. ISO 100, we have tons of light, so there's no need to go higher, and we don't want any of that ISO noise. Release mode, obviously single. Focus mode, single servo, because we don't need the lens focusing in and out all the time. F area mode, normal, I guess. Metering, I didn't even touch that. Color control, standard. There's neutral, vivid, monochrome, portrait, whatever. Go with standard. We don't want the camera messing with colors at all. Exposure compensation, 0. Flash compensation, 0. Now, another important setting, aperture and shutter speed. So aperture, most of the time I'm going with 25. But for example, when I'm photographing large models, then I go 29 because it increases the depth of field. So the furthest part of the model that's from the camera is not going to be blurry. And shutter speed, that depends on the aperture. So my usual setting when I'm shooting at f/25 is 1 and 1.3, sometimes 1.6 seconds. So let's actually take a picture. So we have the same settings, we have found a nice shooting angle, and all we have to do now is just take the picture. Nice. And here's actually a few examples of mismatched shutter speeds and apertures. So for example here, that's not enough time. The picture is overly dark and it will be really tough to fix this in post-production. And the opposite situation is when there's too much time. This was shot at 2 seconds, so it's washed out. Now, because we have finished our shooting session, we can move on to the computer and do some post-processing. Now, for editing, I'm using Lightroom and Photoshop simply because I've been using them for years and I'm used to them at this point. But of course, there are free alternatives. And although I don't geek out over different types of software, here are some examples. So as far as free Lightroom options go, there's Raw Therapy, Darktable, and Capture One offers you a free subscription if you're a Sony user. And different Photoshop softwares are GIMP, Krita, Paint.net, Photopea, Fire Alpaca, Pixel. Honestly, I never heard about some of these, but people on Reddit say good things about them. And personally, I'd rather believe people reviews over some photography webpage making a list of free and not so free softwares. So with that out of the way, we're now gonna fire up Lightroom and let's see what can be done. What the photo basically is right now, it's a sort of blueprint or a roadmap for us. So now we're gonna make a few simple adjustments so it looks like the real thing. Although I have manually set up my white balance on my DSLR, like I said, there are some limitations. And instead of hunting the perfect setting in the camera, it's just easier to make one click in Lightroom. And I already know that my photos are just a tiny bit yellow. So all I'm gonna do is change white balance to 5200 Kelvin. We can max out highlights completely because they only affect everything that's white. Also, same thing with whites. We can go pretty far, and here's when histogram can be very helpful because it tells us those red spots are where pure white is. Now, normally when you're taking a conventional photography, let's say portraits or landscapes, you want to avoid these because pure whites and pure blacks are not natural. But in our case, this is exactly what we need. So we can go all the way up to 100 and we'll take care of the rest in Photoshop. Now, these adjustments make the model more washed out, so we're gonna knock it down with shadows and we're gonna go into negatives. So 20 is obviously too much, so let's say 10. That seems pretty accurate. Now we're gonna play around with this. So we have texture, clarity, vibrance, and saturation. So again, I've been using my DSLR for over a decade, so I'm kind of familiar with what it does. And one thing I know, even though I'm shooting in standard color settings, the photos are still a little bit saturated. So what I normally do, I knock it down between -3 to sometimes -5, because it depends on how close I am to the model, what angle I'm shooting at. For example, if I'm shooting from top, the model reflects more light. This time I'm gonna go with -3. Now, when you go too far with clarity, chances are you'll end up on Reddit on r/stupidhdr, I think. So this is what it does. Obviously, we're not that type of photographer. So because we have no contrast in our photo, because we set it all to flat, we are gonna make it slightly more. And I think 10 is just all right. And also texture, which makes the photo blurry or overly crisp. I don't like to go too far, between 10 and 20, just so every detail and every effect on the model is clearly visible and it's not melting into the background or whatever. And finally, the last adjustment, it's actually more of a repair, is a profile correction. And this is where RAW also comes in handy because it analyzes the lens. The photo is deformed because of the lens, so this fixes it. It's something you'd never notice, but knowing it's there, it's pretty cool. And now we can maybe crop the photo a little, straighten it up, get rid of any empty spaces, and we're pretty much done in Lightroom. Here we have the original file and the processed photo. So basically, we've made the background as white as possible. The flat model was changed to represent the real model more accurately. We slightly adjusted the white balance and fixed the lens distortion. So there are still a few inconveniences there. For example, this edge where the paper was warped. So we're gonna take care of that in Photoshop. And it's very easy. You just use a pure white brush tool and just boom, done. But like we've already seen in Lightroom with the histogram, the background is not completely white. So we're gonna take care of that as well. And the way I do it is first I need to see it, right? So I turn the brightness all the way down and here it is. Now, I'm gonna create a new layer. This is important. And professional Photoshoppers are gonna hate me for this, but I'm the guy who uses Magic Wand tool. But honestly, in this case, it works just fine, right? And now that we have everything set up, it's important to do it in new layer. And it just gets rid of all of that. There's one issue. So now I can get rid of the brightness layer and these edges are now pixelated. So one way to get rid of them is to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and go with radius of 1 pixels. Done. Or we go back and we use feather in the selection and we'll go with 1 pixel again. Now we do the same thing. Deselect, get rid of this, and it's nice and smooth. So yeah, now I can just merge the layers, and that's pretty much as far as I go in Photoshop. So we can save it, and there you have it. Another decent option if you're a Mac user is the Photo app, which is built in the Mac OS. And this actually is really powerful. You have pretty much control over almost everything. Brightness, saturation, white balance, curves, levels, clarity, selective color, noise reduction, sharpening, vignette if you want, and even spot reduction. So I can get rid of these tiny dust particles in the paper, making it look more clean. So that's pretty much it. We have a nice phone picture and a professional, like almost professional studio photo, which will present your model in a really nice, professional looking, clean way. We're not transforming our model into something else. We're not making our chunky tank more slim or making its rear plate bigger so it gets more likes on Instagram. Because everything we have done can be done in the camera settings. But again, those are not perfect and often very limited. So unless you want to blow, I don't know, 2,000 euros for a professional grade camera, it's just faster, simpler and cheaper doing it this way. So I hope you found the video interesting to watch and maybe helpful in some way. It's obviously a lot of ground to cover and I try to make it as concise and short as possible. So thank you for watching, and next week we're gonna build another model. And also thank you to my amazing patrons who make this weekly show possible. There's a lot of going on my Patreon page. There's frequent, almost daily updates from all my projects. I'm already working on the next one right now. There's DMs so we can get in touch. Of course, the so-called almost professional photos like I've just shown you. There's hundreds of them from most of my YouTube projects. You can download them in full resolution. And there's also 1 week early ad-free videos, so you could be watching the next one right now. And what else? Yeah, 3D models made by yours truly. These are mostly details for models, diorama accessories, which I keep making with every project that I tackle. And finally, real-life references, which you might find interesting for dioramas or whatever. And there's one more thing. Obviously, a model which is photographed in ideal studio conditions is gonna look different on a modeling show table, especially when it's overcast, for example, or, you know, the light conditions are not perfect. Well, understandably, it's not gonna look as good as when it's lit up with 3 studio lights. I kinda forgot to mention that in the video, so yeah, until next week, stay safe, stay awesome, stay strong, keep building models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you the next Friday. Cheers!